Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And for anybody who may have missed last week and given me dirty looks or sent me nasty notes, you know who you are. I will do some extensive review here at the beginning. As you can see, I have taken my bad map drawing to a new level by adding color. I colored the water blue.
We need to invest in a smart board.
So now you can see a big blue blob.
Actually, we need to get darker chalk or something.
A
whiteboard, something.
You need to watch smart board hard.
But for now, I will be describing what's going on the map, so hopefully it will make some sense of it. But I did add color, so I'd like that effort to be appreciated. So you may have noticed right off the bat, if you weren't here last time, that I used to have two lists of kings here, one for Israel and one for Judah, and now we're down to one. Because Israel, after last time, is no more. Israel has ceased to exist. We talked about how the Assyrians last time came in. They had already, before last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how they'd basically taken the greater part of Israel already. But they finally succeeded in destroying Israel and even came through and laid siege to Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah. And we talked about how when we get to the book of Isaiah, that whole episode with the prophet Isaiah and Hezekiah is going to get a little more drawn out, a little more full telling of the story. But in the brief telling of the story, Hezekiah repented. And because Hezekiah repented and turned to the Lord, because of that, Jerusalem, the capital, and Judah were spared at the time that Israel went into captivity. So as of 722 BC, Israel ceases to exist because those tribes, as we talked about with the Assyrians took people from the newly conquered portions of their empire and moved them to other parts of their empire and forced the different ethnicities to intermingle and interbreed so that there wouldn't be any ethnic groups with a connection to a piece of land to rise up against them and try and become independent ever. Okay. And so we talked about how the area around the city of Samaria that had been the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel became known generally, that area as Samaria, and how the people who were moved in by the Assyrians essentially became what we discover in the New Testament as Samaritans, as these sort of not really Jewish people, but who have a connection, going back to 722 BC at least, to this piece of land, who have their own version of the Pentateuch that's kind of rewritten to focus on them, and sort of this being their origin. But those other tribes of Israel, other than the tribe of Judah, the Levites who remain at the temple and other facilities, which we'll read more about tonight in Judah, and a piece of the tribe of Benjamin. Other than that, the rest of the tribes of Israel at this point in history vanish. They're gone.
Judah, Benjamin.
Judah, a piece of Benjamin, and the Levites who are there. Okay. So this is why, for example, jumping ahead, when eventually some of the people are able to come back here and reestablish a country, in the New Testament, it's the Roman province of Judea. Right? It's named after Judah, because Israel gone, completely gone to history. When we meet people in the New Testament, you'll find they're pretty much, St. Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Christ and his family, of course, from the tribe of Judah. St. John the Baptist is from the Levitical family, from Levi. That's pretty much it. You don't run into anybody who's from the tribe of Zebulun or Issachar or Dan or Asher. They just don't exist in the New Testament. They don't exist in the world anymore. Okay. Now you will, this isn't even on History Channel documentaries, but if you search the internet, you will find crazy conspiracy theories about the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Okay? That they migrated to various weird places. You know, some of it's weird racist stuff. But that's all fringe, really fringe, weird stuff. The reality is, pretty much everybody agrees, Israel's just gone. Just gone. And so we have this little piece of a remnant that's left of the people of God who we've been talking about in the Old Testament so far. Okay. And we saw how we went through a couple of kings after Hezekiah last time. One of the main ones being Manasseh, who was pretty much the worst of the worst, we were told. Not only in terms of idolatry, but in terms of shedding so much innocent blood, it filled the entire city of Jerusalem. And on and on. We briefly saw his son Ammon, who was named after a pagan god. Give you an idea. And so that brought us to, when we left off, we had just come to King Josiah taking the throne. And I left off there on purpose because Josiah is pretty much the last happy, good point, optimistic point we have left here. And so I wanted to have something a little upbeat. Upbeat at this point. But already, before we finished last time, we had seen hints a little bit in the text of the Bible about what was going on in the world geopolitically. Okay, we saw the Assyrians up here, back a little ways in the text. The Assyrian Empire really had its heyday in the 8th century BC, the 700s BC. The Assyrian Empire sort of just popped up out of nowhere, and I told you a little about it. And now all of a sudden they're going to vanish, and you're going to say, where did they go? But the thing with the Assyrians, I talked a little before about their tactics, how essentially their tactic was to come up and demand that a city surrender. If the city surrendered, they moved all the people around, as their strategy. If they didn't surrender, they would conduct a siege of such horrific brutality and brag about the level of brutality, skinning people alive, making piles of heads, just horrible, gruesome, brutal things, in order to make an example out of that city. So then when they came to the next city and said, we want you to surrender, that city would just say, okay. So the Assyrians were really effective at conquest and at battle and at taking things over. The Assyrians, where they fell down, was they weren't really good at governing. And this is something you're going to find throughout history, that revolutionaries and conquerors tend to be really good at taking power, and then they don't really know what to do once they get it. Right? Same thing's going to happen to Alexander the Great. He's going to conquer the world, and then he's going to drink himself to death because he doesn't really want to be involved in the paperwork of ruling the world. Right? I mean, that's a lot of busy work. And there's nothing left to conquer. Right? So this is a common theme in history, but this is what happens to the Assyrians. The Assyrians, great conquerors, lousy governors. Okay? And we saw how due to, according to the secular sources, an outbreak of the plague, the bubonic plague, according to scriptures, the angel of the Lord coming through the camp, the Assyrian army got stopped at Jerusalem. Okay? And then there was this reference later in Hezekiah's reign to people coming from Babylon. And these people from Babylon came and he showed them around the city. And then God sort of curses Hezekiah for having shown them around the city, which was kind of weird. But we talked about last time how him showing them around the city wasn't just, the board of tourism. It was that what was going on at the time is that Babylon, which is one of the greatest cities of what is at this point the Assyrian Empire, Babylon has some of the greatest building projects, like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Babylon is this incredibly powerful city. And they excel at what the Assyrians are bad at. They're really good at things like building projects. And at governance. And at clerical kinds of things. Okay? So, what was happening at that time is that Babylon was starting to look for allies to try to take control of the empire that the Assyrians had built. And so Hezekiah showing these guys from Babylon around the city wasn't, again, just the Better Homes and Gardens tour. It was, hey, let's talk about maybe forming an alliance here. The whole point God had been making to Hezekiah was, if someone attacks you, you pray to me, you don't have to worry about it. And now he's going and making political alliances against the Assyrians. So he sort of went back on everything that God had been trying to teach him. And that's why he ends up getting told, well, eventually those Babylonians who you were so friendly with are going to end up being your conquerors. Okay. So behind the scenes here, we're not going to actually see him in the text. There's a Babylonian king, the king of the city, named Nabopolassar. Yeah. His son we are going to run into, his son Nebuchadnezzar. But Nabopolassar is his father. And Nabopolassar is going to be the one who actually forms a contingent of other nations, chiefly in alliance with Egypt, and ends up destroying Nineveh, that's the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And so the Assyrian Empire really becomes the Babylonian Empire as a result. Okay, they come in and take over in the same way that later we're going to see Rome comes in and sort of takes over what Alexander the Great had conquered. Babylon sort of comes in and takes over the Assyrian Empire. So this is going on behind the scenes, and we've just seen some hints of it, but we're going to continue to see them here as we go. And then all of a sudden Assyria is going to be gone and Babylon's going to show up. So this is what's going on behind the scenes in the world.
When they come in and take over the cities,
The Babylonians?
Yeah. What do they do to the people that run the city? Do they bring in their own people now to run the city and move these people out?
The Babylonians. No, the Babylonians aren't that way. The Babylonians aren't scorched earth like the Assyrians. The Babylonians will typically come in and they'll send people from the royal family. They'll get members of the royal family to marry somebody. We're going to see this is going to happen in Judah. They get somebody from the royal family to marry one of the local, either wealthy folks, former royal family, whoever they've got, right? Whoever seems to be in charge. And then they put that member of the royal family in charge. Sort of as the prince of this city or this region.
So you go marry this old girl and all of a sudden you got a problem.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So Nebuchadnezzar, for example, is going to take his sons and daughters and marry them to all these different people and then set those people up as sort of princes, and they're all his family members. Right? So they're all connected that way. But they also have some connection to the local people.
Which tends to breed some rather dysfunctional families, right?
Yes, but also the idea is that by doing that, the people can pretend they have some kind of independence. You know, they can pretend they're being governed by Prince so-and-so and his wife. You know? Even though really it's Nabopolassar or Nebuchadnezzar who's getting all their taxes back at home in Babylon. They can sort of pretend that they still have some kind of autonomy. Rather than forcibly, like the Assyrians did, breaking those things up, the Babylonians try and play on those relationships that always exist and use those to enforce their own power. So it's a little bit of a difference in strategy there. We're going to see that as we go forward in terms of how they relate to Judah as opposed to how the Assyrians related to Judah. Remember, the Assyrians related to Judah by basically walking up to the walls of Jerusalem and talking smack on their king, their god. Them, telling them how they were about to be destroyed in graphic detail. That's how the Assyrians related. The Babylonians are very different in their approach. Some of the outcomes might end up being the same, but in their approach, they're very different. Okay. The last note as we go into this is right now, the Pharaoh in Egypt is named Necho. As far as I know, he has no connection to the popular
Not
wafers.
the king, not the king.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's no connection. But the Pharaoh of Egypt's name is Necho, and he's the other major power in the world. He's the counterbalance. Remember last time when the Assyrians were talking to Jerusalem and when they were talking to Samaria, even they kept bringing up the Egyptians because it was their assumption that if Judah was resisting, it was probably because they thought they had Egypt on their side. Because as far as the Assyrians were concerned, and really as far as the Babylonians are concerned later, the only people they have to worry about is Egypt. There's nobody else who's really, Moab and Edom still exist, but they're not worried about Moab and Edom raising an army and coming and attacking them, reasonably.
I got a question. I know where Egypt and all that is, but where are we up there with the Babylonians? Where is that?
Babylon is in what's
Babylon.
now eastern Iraq.
It was in
Oh,
Iraq.
okay.
And Saddam Hussein at one point started trying to rebuild part of it.
We did build part of it.
He built one
Yeah, it
gate.
was Tim saw Babylon when it was in Iraq.
And the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was more in western.
Our Armenians aren't this.
And
Yeah, so we went to the roads, he toured the roads.
one further note,
Saddam was trying.
if you've ever been, or if you ever go to the British Museum, they have, from excavations, they have big chunks of Nineveh there. Including, there are these two huge, remember we talked about what cherubim actually are? That they're those sort of sphinx things with the
It
beards.
was like the whole beards.
Yeah. There are two of those who are at the gates of Nineveh that are about, 50 feet high, 60 feet high?
Yeah.
They're at the British Museum.
Yeah.
That must be true.
And the way they had them, at least when I was at the British Museum, the way they had them set up on either way of a hallway that led into a whole area where they had these carved wall reliefs that were on the city walls in Nineveh. There were portraits of the kings,
Excuse me.
hunting and killing things.
We're in the British Museum in London.
Yeah.
I've been there. Okay.
You remember seeing
So-
the big statues?
Yes. Yes. Okay.
So, yeah, you could still see parts of Nineveh left over from Nabopolassar.
Just gotta go to England. to
Just
see
have to go to London. Okay. So all that to bring us up to Josiah, who is the son of Ammon, who is the son of Manasseh. So he's got his father and his grandfather are not good people. However, chapter 22, verse 1, and we're in 4th Kingdoms or 2nd Kings. 4th Kingdoms if you're in Orthodox Study Bible, 2nd Kings, anything else. Chapter 22, verse 1, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adiah. She was from Bozkat. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. There's something we haven't seen pretty much ever. Walked in all the ways of his father David, followed the same path, didn't go off to the right, didn't go off to the left. Okay? And this is why, as I mentioned last time, when you look at the icon that we have out on Holy Saturday of the harrowing of hell, where Christ is in Hades and he's grabbing onto Adam and Eve and pulling them out of their tombs. On the one side is St. John the Baptist, St. John the Forerunner, and the prophets, and you usually have Isaiah and Ezekiel over there with him, at least. On the other side there are kings. And the two kings who are always there's always a guy with a brown beard, who's King David, and there's a guy with no beard. And the guy with no beard, the reason he has no beard is Josiah was 8 years old when he took the throne. He's supposed to look like a young man. That's Josiah.
I don't understand how an 8-year-old kid, after, growing up and his father and grandfathers were total bad,
Yeah.
how did he?
We're about to read and find out. Because something happens. We can expect he was probably raised the same way the rest of his family was, but then some events here are going to happen and are going to change things. Verse 3, in the 18th year of his reign, so now he's 26, so he's been king for a while. King Josiah sent the secretary, Shaphan, son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the temple of the Lord. He said, "Go up to Hilkiah the high priest and have him get ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. Have them entrusted to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. Have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, and the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dressed stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them because they are acting faithfully." So remember a couple of weeks ago when they started taking up the special collection for the building fund? Remember they put the chest there next to the altar of burnt offering? And that was for repairs to the temple. Well, as we've seen since then, we've had some kings up to some shenanigans who have stripped a lot of gold and silver out of the temple. Okay. And so Josiah now, we can see even now he's already sort of on the right track. He says, "I want you to go and take that collection, and I want you to pay the workmen to get to work on trying to fix the temple." Okay. Now, as we go forward here, we've been talking a lot, and I've mentioned several times the fact that, and as we've seen, Judah hasn't really been doing better than Israel, but that God keeps sort of sparing them for the sake of the promise he made to David, that a king would always sit on his throne. And God, in fact, keeps saying in the text, "For my servant David's sake, I will spare you." We're going to see here in this next couple of chapters just how far gone Judah has gotten at this point, and it's going to get ugly. But so Josiah, already on the right track, wants to go and do repairs to the temple. Verse 8, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Okay. So they go to do these renovations, and lo and behold, they find the book of the law. Now, from some clues later on, this book of the law is specifically the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. Out of the first 5 books of the Bible. We call them books, and of course when we hear the word book, we think of book, but in reality these are scrolls. Okay, and they could only make scrolls of a certain size at this point in history. So each of these was it was actually the 5 scrolls of Moses, not the 5 books of Moses as we typically think of it. So, but this scroll they find is the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, I'm going to pause here to note, if you watch the History Channel or read many books about this period of Old Testament history, they will claim that King Josiah wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? He didn't find anything. He saw that his country was falling apart, and so he wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. Now, this theory was actually debunked about 30 years ago. But for some reason, people still say it. Because I guess if people keep saying it, that means it might still be true. But about 30 years ago, there was a book published that showed that the format that the book of Deuteronomy follows, we talked about how a covenant was like a contract or a treaty. Right? Well, an Old Testament researcher found a whole bunch of examples of these Hittite treaties from the 13th century. These Hittite treaties between kings and vassal kings, between vassal kings and each other, treaties that ended wars, treaties that were trade agreements. Okay, found a whole ton of the Hittites. They're up in what's now Turkey. Okay, tons of them. And he wrote a book, and he demonstrated in the book that the book of Deuteronomy has the exact same structure as one of these 13th century Hittite treaties. Okay, which you would expect if it came from someone around the time of Moses, right? You'd expect it to look like a covenant book from the 13th century would look like a covenant book from the 13th century, right? Now, if you want to argue that Josiah wrote it, we're now in the 600s BC. Josiah was both an archaeologist and a genius, because he was able to go back 600 years, 600 years in history, find these documents, right, and forge the book of Deuteronomy to perfectly match. Okay? It makes no sense.
Like Joseph Smith.
Right. It makes no sense. And so that theory was pretty much debunked. And pretty much since then, everybody has accepted that maybe not the book of Deuteronomy exactly as we have it today, but that whatever's behind that, the original document, goes back to somewhere in the 12th, 13th century BC. Okay, there's something that goes back further. So you could argue maybe that at the time of Josiah, now when they rediscover it, maybe they put it into modern for them Hebrew. You know, maybe they translate, they copied it, you know, and transcribed it into more modern alphabet. You know, all that probably did happen. Okay. But what we have in Deuteronomy can't possibly have been written at this time. It makes no sense. So it is more logical to conclude, despite what those documentaries will probably continue to say, it is more logical to conclude that they actually found this scroll at this point in history, after it had been lost for several centuries. Okay. Now, how lost it was is going to be called into question in a second, though, also. But the king, at least, had been unaware of it. It had been somewhere in the temple all this time. Most logical conclusion. Part of the reason why they still want to say it's written now is that there are a couple of factors. One, the people who study religion in general, they want to say that the whole Old Testament was written around 500 BC. Because if the whole Old Testament was written around 500 BC, then that means it was written about the same time Buddha lived, at the same time philosophy started in Greece. And so then they can kind of lump those all together. Because, of course, they don't believe any of them are true. Now, we, of course, believe that this is true. So, for us, it's not a problem if it goes back farther. But that's one reason why they want to date it later. And also because, of course, they don't believe in prophecy. Right? Because they don't believe it's true. They don't believe that something that was written in the 13th century could predict things that were going to happen in, say, the 6th or 7th century BC.
They must have written the Old Testament
Or today.
in the 2nd century AD.
Well, and you'll see the same thing when we get into the New Testament in a couple of years. And we're talking about the New Testament books. You'll see they try to push the New Testament books as far back as they possibly can. Now, it's not very far because we have copies that go back into the 2nd century, you know. But they try to push them back as far as they possibly, as far away from the actual Jesus as they possibly can. Because the more space they can get between Jesus and the Gospels, for example, the more wiggle room they have to play with, right? They can say, oh, this wasn't written until 50 years after Jesus lived. See, it's all made up. Or it's full of errors or folktales. Blah, blah, blah. You know, so it's that same kind of thing. You can take it less seriously if everything's written after the fact. So, but despite that, if you really want to read the book that debunked it, it's a book called Treaty of the Great King by Meredith Kline. It's out of print as far as I know. But that was the book that sort of debunked the idea that Deuteronomy was written much later. Okay, so the high priest, when they're going in to do the repairs, he goes in, finds this copy of Deuteronomy, he gives it to the royal secretary reads it. Verse 9, then Shaphan the secretary went to the king and reported to him, your officials have paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord, and have entrusted it to the workers and supervisors at the temple. Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. Okay, so Josiah hears, remember, we were going through Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is Moses' parting sermon. Here's what you need to do when you get into the land. Well, Josiah hears it, and you can imagine, as he's going through the book, he's ticking off. Well, we didn't do that. We did the opposite of that. We didn't do that. We didn't do that. So he gets this overwhelming, we've gone the exact opposite way from what God told us to go. And so he tears his clothes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's attendant. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written there concerning us. Okay? So he says, you need to find somebody right, who can interpret this book for us. Because the way I'm reading it, we're in trouble. Right? We are in big trouble. So he sends all of his main servants and attendants of the royal guard. He says, go find somebody who can explain this. So who do you imagine, before we go any further, from what we've talked about? We talked about how Israel and Judah have become corrupt. Who is it who's holding on to the old traditional religions?
Prophets.
The prophets, right? This company of the prophets. Okay. So that's exactly where they go. Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to speak to the prophetess Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum the son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the second district, and she studied the law. Okay? So, apparently it was lost to some people. Apparently the company of the prophets still had copies. They were still following it, right? They were still reading it, studying it, living by it, right? And so they go and they find this woman who has spent her life studying the book that now they have questions about. Right? She's the first one they find. As you can see, she's married to sort of a minor official, the keeper of the king's wardrobe, right, who's in charge of his clothing. She said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and provoked me to anger by all the idols their hands have made. My anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Well, that's not good news. So she says, go tell King Josiah, yeah, he read that right. Judah and Jerusalem are in big trouble, right, because of everything they've done. Their judgment is coming. But, verse 18, tell the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become accursed and laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place. So they took her answer back to the king. Okay, so says the back, well, I got good news and I got bad news. Good news is King Josiah, because he repented, isn't going to have to see or suffer through what's coming. Bad news is it's coming. Right? But now what's interesting, see, now we're going to go to the next step. So what does King Josiah do? Because we've seen kings in the past, right, who have repented. Hezekiah last time. We've seen individual kings who repent. And you kind of get things straightened out, at least partially, at least for a while. Right? So King Josiah, he receives this oracle from God. He could have said, oh, okay. Right? Finished his reign. He's 26. He's going to reign, 13 more years. Finished out his reign, died in peace like God said. But what does he do here? Chapter 23. 23 verse 1. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, regulations, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. What it literally says there, and I think they have this in the Orthodox Study Bible because they're being very literal to the Greek. It says that the people, this translation, had pledged themselves to the covenant. Literally says the people took a stand.
Stood to the covenant.
All the people who stand to the covenant.
Right. And this is actually where the part of where the phrase "take a stand" comes from. But the idea isn't just that they stood up while it was being read. Right? It's not just that. It's that they all agreed now. So Josiah doesn't just say, "Okay, whew, thank you, God, for the fire insurance. See the rest of you guys later." Right? He says,
Okay, you're done.
he says, no, this is what our fathers pledged to God to do. They didn't do it. We're going to do it. And so he gets everybody together. He reads it to them again, make sure they understand, and they all agree to it again. They all agree to it again. He doesn't stop there. Verse 4, the king ordered Hilkiah the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts. Why are there a bunch of articles made for Baal and Asherah and various heavenly bodies in the temple? Well, they're gone now. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the pagan priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. That common people isn't a good translation. It's scattered over the graves of their ancestors.
This is children.
Children of the people. It's very literally it's the children of the covenant, meaning the people who agreed to the covenant originally. The people who agreed to it originally and didn't follow it. He goes to their graves and dumps the refuse of their false religion on their graves, basically. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes which were in the temple of the Lord and where women did weaving for Asherah. Again, why was all that there? This is part of that, how bad it had gotten. Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He broke down the shrines at the gates, at the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which is on the left of the city gate. Although the priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. He desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Molech. We talked before about 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 Molech worship, how people they had basically a large bronze statue of the god Molech that they had a furnace going inside of, and they'd heat it super hot, and people would come and lay babies in his hands. He had multiple hands, so they would burn to death. This was the way that they worshiped Molech. At the center for worshiping Molech in Israel was this valley of Ben Hinnom. Okay, and you can see a little bit in Ben Hinnom. This is going to get taken over and mentioned in by Christ in the New Testament as Gehenna. He talks about things burning in Gehenna because of this, because of what it was originally used for to worship Molech, the people after this, all the way to Jesus' time, are going to use it to burn garbage, to burn the bodies of convicted criminals, to dispose of basically anything that's unclean. Okay? And so there's going to be, you have the combination of this horrible uncleanness and fire and smoke there pretty much day and night from this time forward. And so this is the image that Jesus uses of hell, what we call hell. We'll get to that in a couple of years when we get into the Gospel of Matthew. But this is that same place, the Valley of Hinnom, that Jesus is going to refer to as an example later on. And this is why the God reputation is such a horrible place, what was done there. He removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the room of an official named Natan-Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. So apparently there was sun worship going on in addition. Most likely based on the fact that the previous king, his father was named Ammon, probably Egyptian sun worship going on. He pulled down the altars the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem on the south of the hill of corruption, the ones Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. So, remember, way back in the 900s, we talked about how Solomon had built these temples for his foreign wives, right, to these foreign gods, including this one to Molech here again. They've been here this whole time. Been here this whole time, fully operational, until now, when Josiah destroys them. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. Where is he getting the human bones? They're digging up again their ancestors who are the ones who started this. And throwing their bones, because human remains, remember, are unclean. Are unclean. So by throwing them out, you can't use it as a worship site anymore. And it's this, again, judgment against their fathers. See, Josiah is joining in. God's judgment, he's had revealed to him, is against his fathers, the people of Judah, for what they've done. And so he's essentially agreeing with God. He's like, you're right. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Remember, the northern kingdom of Israel broke away, and Jeroboam built two golden calves, one at Dan, the very north of the kingdom, and one at Bethel, the very south on the border with Judah. So there's no Israel there anymore. Josiah goes to Bethel, who had caused Israel to sin. Even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. Remember when Jeroboam first set up those altars, and he was making the first big sacrifices there in Bethel to sort of kick things off with this new religion? And God sent the prophet to come and tell him, one day your bones are going to burn on that altar.
They burn.
Here it is.
Here it comes.
That's this 300 years later. Okay, 300 years later, the tombs of the kings of Israel are right there. And so Josiah says, go get their bones. And they bring their bones out and burn them. Verse 17, the king asked, what is that tombstone I see? The men of the city said, it marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it. Leave it alone, he said, don't let anyone disturb his bones. So they spared his bones and those of the prophet who had come from Samaria. So the prophets, who were the only ones who were faithful, they leave them alone. But the kings, not so much. Just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed and defiled all the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria that had provoked the Lord to anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places on the altars and burned human bones on them. Then he went back to Jerusalem. So this is again, we see a lot of killing here, but this is Josiah participating in God's judgment. God's told him, I'm going to wipe out Judah and Jerusalem for what you've done. Okay? He doesn't go and destroy his own city, but he goes and he tries to wipe out the evil that's in Judah and Jerusalem that God's judgment is against. So verse 21, all this done now, having expunged all this false religion, Josiah comes back to his capital of Jerusalem. The king gave this order to all the people: celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God as it is written in the book of the covenant. Not since the days of the judges who led Israel, nor throughout the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed.
I know who it is.
Well, she forgot her battery upstairs.
Come on. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So Josiah says, okay, now we're going to have the Passover. Again, to show you, we talked about how bad the period of the judges was, and how sort of the knowledge of what was going on with God and his covenant just about vanished. Well, they haven't had Passover, even in Judah, they haven't had Passover since the time of the judges. Meaning, while Saul was king, while David was king, while Solomon was king, no Passover. They've essentially never had it. I mean, for a few years right after they came into the land, and then gone.
They
Just
never
forgotten about it.
celebrate Passover at all. They just give it up.
So they just stopped doing it. And remember, we saw in Judges, we saw how these other feasts started showing up.
Yeah.
Like the Jephthah's daughter feast, and you're going, wait, where did that come from? These other pagan traditions came in, and they liked those better. Had more prostitutes, I guess. But
Josiah is the first one, from what I gather, that has destroyed everything,
right, cleaned house.
cleaned house completely.
Yeah,
Because it always amazed me, even, where some of the better...
they do a little bit.
Yeah, they do a little bit, but they don't get rid of all the stuff in
Yeah.
the hinterland, so to speak.
Yeah, they sort of leave the people out in the farms to do whatever they were doing. Right. See, this is when Josiah hears Deuteronomy, the thing that he keys in on is that this isn't just... See, you have to understand, in every other culture in the world at this time, their gods didn't care about regular people. Right? So, the god might talk to the king, right, on occasion. Right? The king might get his attention on occasion. But he didn't care about the people and anybody else. Right? What Josiah sees or reads the book of Deuteronomy is that this is not a covenant between God and his king, right, who's some kind of demigod. It's a covenant between God and his people. All of them. That's why he gets them all together. And so Josiah sees that it matters what farmer Shlomo is doing, out on the edge of nowhere in that high place, burning incense to the moon. Right? God cares about that. Right? God cares deeply about that. Just as much as he cares about who Josiah is praying to. He cares about Farmer Shlomo. So this is what Josiah, and this is why he really cleans house. This is why he really cleans house. The other kings have become so much like the kings of the other nations that they thought, God's related to the world through them personally. And that the whole thing was about the two of them. As we see in Deuteronomy, God never really wanted them to have a king. There's that one kind of backhanded mention of when you have a king. He never told them to have a king, but he said when you have a king, the king shouldn't do this and this and this. All of which we also know Josiah pretty much realized, oh, I did all those things. But because we're going to find out he had a couple of wives here later on. But, so yeah, he's in on that. And so he's really trying to rededicate the whole people, with the hope that, and see, this is another reason why King Josiah is so important to remember. He's already gotten his get-out-of-jail-free card. God's already promised him he's not going to see this judgment. He's trying to save everybody else. He's trying to say, well, look, in this book, the same book that promised judgment, if we do these evil things, it promises blessings and healing if we repent and do these good things. So let's do it. Let's do it. And so he's not just trying to save his own skin. he's trying to save the whole nation, the whole people. So in that way, his heart sort of mirrors God's heart toward the people, because just like God cares about Farmer Shlomo and what he's doing, Josiah cares about Farmer Shlomo now and wants him to not have to face what's coming if they continue down the path they're on. So verse 23, but in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. So they finally celebrate Passover. Furthermore, Josiah got rid of the mediums and spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all the other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. This he did to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had discovered in the temple of the Lord. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. Now that repeated thing we've seen, with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his strength, that's one of the clues that it's the book of Deuteronomy, because that, of course, is where we find that commandment. Over and over again, remember, God talks about the people's hearts in Deuteronomy. And so that's another clue that it's that particular book is the one that he was reading and dealing with. Verse 26, nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger which burned against Judah, because of all that Manasseh had done to provoke him to anger. So the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my presence as I removed Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose, and this temple about which I said, there shall my name be. As for the other events of Josiah's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? So we get our usual refrain there. And what God says there may seem like, well, geez, there's no pleasing him. Right? I mean, Josiah went out and did all this stuff. He got the people to swear back to God. Well, God knows what's coming in the next chapter. God knows what's coming next, So he knows how long this is going to last. But so verse 29, while Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. Okay. So this is part of that geopolitical thing going on. Babylon is making its move against the rest of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians make an alliance with Pharaoh Necho of Egypt to try to help them against the Babylonians. Okay. So Necho is heading up. Remember we talked about last time how this area is referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Down here is desert. This area is arable land where you can grow things. Okay, so when people travel, so if you're going from Egypt up here to help the Assyrians, you're going to be going right through our territory. So Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. Why would Josiah go out to fight him? Remember we talked about Hezekiah and those visitors from Babylon? And that not being just a visit? Okay. So Judah has this alliance with Babylon. They go to the valley of Megiddo, which is next to Mount Megiddo. The word for mountain in Hebrew is Har. And from Har Megiddo we get Armageddon. Which, again, about 3 years or so when we get to the book of Revelation. Even that's being a little ambitious, but we'll see more of Armageddon. But this is one of dozens of major battles in world history that get fought in that valley next to that mountain. Is this one between Josiah and Pharaoh Necho, in which Josiah is killed. So verse 30, Josiah's servants brought his body in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in place of his father. So Jehoahaz becomes king. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother was Hamutal. The daughter of Jeremiah, and she was from Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his fathers had done. Pretty impressive in 3 months, too. So in 3 months, he takes everything his father had tried to do and goes right back to the old way of doing things. Pharaoh Necho put him in chains at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. That's about 3 3/4 tons of silver and 75 pounds of gold. If you're keeping track, that's pretty hefty tax. So the reality is, how much reigning he did, we don't know, because he's Josiah's heir. So after killing Josiah, Pharaoh Necho takes him prisoner. Okay, and then basically ransoms him to Jerusalem for this exorbitant amount of silver and gold. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, son of Josiah, king in place of his father Josiah, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz and carried him off to Egypt, and there he died. So after getting his ransom, he doesn't return Jehoahaz. He takes Jehoahaz's younger brother, another son of Josiah, makes him king. He makes him king with the obvious intent that now, since he's king because of Pharaoh, now instead of being allied with Babylon, now Judah's going to be allied with Egypt. Okay. That's the idea. So now the king of Judah pretty much owes his throne to the Egyptian Pharaoh. Now when we get to the book of Jeremiah, this part that we're going through fairly quickly right now is going to be expanded on again, the same way Hezekiah was in Isaiah. we're going to see a lot more of what's going on. A lot more of what's going on. Because after, as we're going to see here coming up, after Babylon succeeds in removing our friends the Assyrians and removing Nineveh and setting up the Babylonian Empire, they're going to come to Judah, and we're going to see in the book of Jeremiah the temptation is going to be for Judah to rely on Egypt to protect them. And God's going to keep saying to them, Egypt can't protect you. The only person who can protect you is me. You remember the one who brought you out of Egypt? Right? Remember, I took Pharaoh out once, you know? He's not such a tough guy. So that there's going to be that whole interplay. This is where that comes from, this idea that now, once we get to Jehoiakim, essentially the monarchy of Judah is being propped up by Egypt. So verse 35, Jehoiakim paid Pharaoh Necho the silver and gold he demanded. In order to do so, he taxed the land and exacted the silver and gold from the people of the land according to their assessments. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Zebedah, daughter of Pedaiah. She was from Rumah. And this right here tells us that Josiah had more than one wife.
I was just going to say that.
Now we can presume that he took those multiple wives before the book of Deuteronomy. That's one of the reasons he tore his clothes, is when he got to the part with, when you have a king, let him not multiply wives.
He's been multiplying pretty good.
Why was his name changed?
The changing of a name, especially in Egypt, in the Egyptian religious beliefs, if you knew someone's name, you had complete power over them. So the idea that you can change someone's name means that you have complete power and control over them. So the Pharaoh changing his name is essentially a power play. Say, you are who I say you are. Lest you think that being king of Judah makes you special. You ain't special. I can do with you as I please. So that's the significance of that. It's the Pharaoh putting the boot even further, in addition to the taxation, grinding them down a little more.
Which is also what they do in monasteries.
Well, yeah.
What is that?
James said it's all in monasteries.
They give
You're given a new name because you're giving up your own identity and your own self-will. That's the idea. Now this is less to build humility and more for humiliation. In this case. Chapter 24. During Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. So here's Nebuchadnezzar. So if you have a really modern translation, and by that I don't mean the Orthodox Study Bible. If you have a really modern translation, it probably has Nebuchadrezzar as an R, so the second N. That's because his actual Babylonian name was Nabuchodonosor.
Okay, whatever.
Nabu was the name of the Babylonian family god. It's Nabopolassar, his father, was also. That's where the Nabu comes. So his actual given name is the Utzer at the end. That's what his mom would have called him. But his full title is Nabuchodonosor Utzer, which is shortened into, like I said, in a modern one, they'll have Nebuchadrezzar or Nebuchadnezzar. And so his father did most of the Assyrian conquering, and so Nebuchadnezzar is the one who really gets to sort of stretch into being the full-time emperor and governing a big chunk of the world at that time. And so he now comes to Judah, and he makes Jehoiakim, basically by threatening to come in and invade and get rid of Jehoiakim, makes Jehoiakim his vassal. Okay? meaning he dictates terms to Jehoiakim. You pay me X amount per year, and I let you continue to pretend to be king of Judah. And if ever you don't pay me, well, then we'll just stop pretending and I'll come in and take over. Okay. So verse 1, during Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the land. Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years, but then he changed his mind and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Again, we're going to have more details of this when we get into the book of Jeremiah. But he gets this idea into his head that his old friend Pharaoh, who propped him up, will have his back if he decides to fight the Babylonian Empire. And we'll see how that goes. The Lord sent Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against him. He sent them to destroy Judah in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by his servants the prophets. Surely these things happened to Judah according to the Lord's command, in order to remove them from his presence, because of the sins of Manasseh and all he had done, including the shedding of innocent blood, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. As for the other events of Jehoiakim's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim rested with his fathers, and Jehoiachin succeeded him as king. Yes, he's not the Chinese king of... Jehoiachin succeeded him as king. The king of Egypt did not march out from his own country again, because the king of Babylon had taken all his territory from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River. So, Nebuchadnezzar has come down and taken everything down here, sort of pushed Pharaoh back into Egypt. And so that's why this comment of Pharaoh choosing not to ride forth again. So Jehoiakim says, well, my friend Pharaoh will have my back if I rebel against the Babylonians. And Pharaoh doesn't ride forth. Leaves him dangling in the wind. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of El-Natan. She was from Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, advanced on Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself came up to the city while his officers were besieging it. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, his mother, his attendants, his nobles, and his officials all surrendered to him. So again, remember, the queen mother is this position. So it's him, his mother is the first main court official, and then the other court officials all come out and surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. In the 8th year of the reign of the king of Babylon, he took Jehoiachin prisoner. As the Lord had declared, Nebuchadnezzar removed all the treasures from the temple of the Lord and from the royal palace, and took away all the gold articles that Solomon, king of Israel, had made for the temple of the Lord. So we've been giving away a lot of stuff over the years, but pretty much everything left Nebuchadnezzar now takes. He carried into exile all Jerusalem, all the officers and fighting men, and all the craftsmen and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest people of the land were left. So when they surrender, he basically looks around, and anybody who's got a trade, anybody who's got any money, anybody who's got any skills he can use, anybody who he could put to work, takes back to Babylon with him. Everybody who's left, anybody who's sick, elderly, old, poor, not fit to work, doesn't know a trade, he leaves there. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. He also took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 craftsmen and artisans. He made Medaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So there's a name change again. Now this is a really ironic one. Because Zedekiah means Yahweh is just. That's what Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to. As Judah is collapsing around them. His name is Yahweh is just. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. Recognize that name from anywhere? It's Jehoahaz's mother. It's one of King Josiah's wives. Same woman.
Same person.
Yeah, Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah. And see, what he did was, right, he takes his uncle, right? So, remember, these two are brothers. Right? Takes the uncle, the third brother, and makes him king, and he's another, and so he's got the same mother. In other words, Zedekiah is Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim's brother. Jehoiakim's half-brother, Jehoahaz's brother. Same mother. In verse 19, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord just as Jehoiakim had done. It was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah, and in the end he thrust them from his presence. Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So again, what does he do? He tries the same strategy that his half-brother Jehoiakim tried. He tries to rebel again, thinking that the Egyptians will have his back. Chapter 25, verse 1. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So for 2 years, they're under siege. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. Okay, so to make matters worse, after this 2-year siege, Babylonians finally break through the wall. And what does the king and his army do? Run for it. Right? They make a run for they run for the desert.
I didn't realize they had any army left.
Well, whoever he had put together, right? Because remember, what's called the first deportation that we read about was just from the city of Jerusalem. Just from the city of Jerusalem. So presumably, whatever army he had would have come from he probably gathered some people from others, but I mean, you don't read about any big battle that they have. So I mean, it wasn't this army turned tails and run instead of fighting and heads for the desert with the king. But Nebuchadnezzar catches up with them near Jericho and wipes them out. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah. Their sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. Okay. So as I said, the Babylonians didn't come with the same approach that the Assyrians did. But that doesn't mean you really wanted to mess with them either. Right? So Zedekiah, the last thing he sees are all his sons being killed. They killed in front of him, meaning your royal line is done. and then he gets hauled away in chains. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. The Babylonians broke up the bronze pillars, the movable stands, and the bronze sea that were at the temple of the Lord, and they carried the bronze to Babylon. They also took away the pots, shovels, wick trimmers, ladles, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all that were made of gold or silver. The bronze from the 2 pillars, the sea, and the movable stands which Solomon had made for the temple of the Lord was more than could be weighed. Each pillar was 27 feet high. The bronze capital on top of one pillar was 4.5 feet high, and was decorated with a network and pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar with its network was similar. The commander of the guard took as prisoners Sariah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. Of those still in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisors. He also took the secretary, who was chief officer in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of his men who were found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them all and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. There at Riblah in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be over the people he had left behind in Judah. So he doesn't even bother at this point propping up a king. He just sort of sends a governor to keep an eye on things, because all that's left there are some farmers. He left behind Judah. When all the army officers and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah as governor, they came to Gedaliah at Mizpah. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, Johanan, son of Kezriah, Sariah, son of Tehumeth, and the Netophathite, Jezaniah, the son of Makkathite, and their men. Gedaliah took an oath to reassure them and their men. "Do not be afraid of the Babylonian officials," he said. "Settle down in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will go well with you." In the 7th month, however, Ishmael, son of Netaniah, the son of Elishama, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah, and also the men of Judah, and the Babylonians who were with him at Mizpah. At this, all the people from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. So even the people who are left behind, right? They put this governor, the Babylonians put this governor in charge of it. What do? They go and assassinate the governor. Yeah. So, at least at this point, they haven't learned their lesson. And after they assassinate the governor, where do they run? Egypt. Verse 27. Here we get our slightly hopeful ending. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year Evil-Merodach became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiachin from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. So our slight hope there at the end is that Jehoiachin, even though not a great king, he is still alive. Why is it important that he's still alive?
We have
David's line.
David's line. The line of Christ.
So David's line continues even in captivity. And of course, ultimately, we're going to get one more on this list, and that's going to be Jesus, whose mother was Mary, son of Joachim, who was from Bethlehem. It's going to be the last one on this list. He's going to sit on David's throne forever. But this happens in 586 BC. So you can see those couple chapters when I said it gets zoomed out later on in the prophets.
Activity.
We cover, yeah, this is the final deportation.
Final.
It's 586. So this little part we covered tonight really ran about 100 years, a little over 100 years. So as we said, when we get into the prophets, a lot of this is going to be fleshed out with what was going on day by day on the streets of Samaria or on the streets of Jerusalem, as the prophets were coming from God and trying to call the people to repent, and how the king and the people were reacting. All that's going to be fleshed out more as we get into those books. But now that we reach the end of the books of kingdoms or the books of the kings, this is a good point. Does anybody happen to have today's bulletin? I know some people didn't get today's bulletin. We need to print more bulletins.
Here it is.
Do you notice on the front how it described Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden? It didn't use the word expelled. It used the word exile. This is the exile. This is the Babylonian exile. This story is basically the story of the whole Old Testament. Exile. We saw it all the way back. Remember, predicted. The end of Deuteronomy. When that day comes, when you have not kept the covenant, I will take you to a foreign land. And I will bring you back again. But even before that, when Moses tells us about the beginning of the human race, Genesis 2 through 4, it's a story about exile. God creates human beings. He gives them a land that's full of plenty in the garden. They rebel against Him. They refuse it. And they're exiled. So that happens with Adam and Eve in microcosm. Now we see it happens with the whole nation. This is the pattern. This is the pattern that the Old Testament shows us. Is this pattern of exile. So, if we look at our salvation in terms of the exile, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is you don't have to keep working and trying to get salvation because God already gave it to you. The bad news is we lost it. Adam and Eve didn't earn the garden. They didn't earn their way into it. The Israelites sure as shooting didn't earn their way into the land. Right? In fact, the first generation dropped dead before they saw it. Right? The second generation, God gave it to them, but they weren't any better. Right? And at what point in Israel or Judah's history, we just read they hadn't even had Passover. They hadn't even celebrated the Feast of Passover. The tiniest thing. You got to have a big family meal. I mean, if you're not going to do that, what are you going to do? Nothing, ever. They never kept it. Never kept it for a second. And God was patient with them and patient with them and patient with them. And then, excellent. This is why the Christian life is described as a life of repentance. Because to a certain extent, when you're baptized and you're chrismated and you receive the Holy Spirit and you receive salvation, you're receiving the whole thing. You're not getting Orthodox Faith Part 1 and then you have to work your way to the rest. You got the whole thing. Boom. Handed to you. And then if you're anything like me, within about 2 days.
Less.
2 hours. Right? Already the shine's gone off it. Right? Within a couple of minutes. Right? And then you start wearing at the enamel. Right? And pretty soon you can't tell it was ever there. But it was there. And that's why the Christian life of repentance is of return. Because what God says again and again in the law, what He says more often than actually giving commandments in the law, is if you will repent. then I will heal you and restore you. But there's more good news than that. Because just saying that, life is a depressing cycle, right? Of us getting grace and then falling away from it over and over and over again, right? God's going to bring the people back, but do you think they're going to be obedient? Right? Exiled again. Is that cycle just going to keep going on forever and ever and ever? Right. Well, I'm going to go back even further in Genesis. Genesis 1. 6 days God creates the world. 7th day He rested. Why? Because there's that one day at the end of the week that's holding out that hope that there's rest coming. There's going to be an end to all this work. I remember Christ said, when the Pharisees came to Him and gave Him a hassle about His disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath. He says, do you think God is resting? He said, God is working even up till now. Until He hung on the cross. And just before He died, He said, it's finished. Or He actually says, it's completed. It's done. And then He rested on the 7th day of the week. He rested on the Sabbath in the tomb and rose on the next day. Because in the background of this, even though we have this cycle of us screwing up and God bringing us back, and us screwing up and God bringing us back, in the background, there's this line of King David going on. In the background, there's this promise that started right after the first exile from the Garden of Eden. Remember, the seed of the woman is going to come. And then it was a prophet like Moses. Right? And now it's this king who's going to reign on David's throne forever. That someone is going to come who's going to fix it and put an end to that. And that's what Christ does. That's why it's so critical to see Christ in this. Because how depressing would the world be if our whole life was just God giving us blessings and grace and us screwing it up? But the point is, Christ comes in and He intervenes. And He puts an end to that cycle. Puts an end to that cycle. Okay. And so that's the promise, even here at the end with Jehoiachin, that we're looking toward. We're looking toward the end of that, so where there's not going to be another exile. There's not going to be another turning away. Okay. Because all that curse from Deuteronomy that was promised to us for the things we do every day, all that curse that was promised to us, Jesus was cursed. God took the curse Himself. No curse left for us. That ends the cycle. That ends the cycle. Okay. So this is an important milestone we just got to in the Old Testament. In terms of, we've now seen the big picture. A lot of what we read from now on, we have a few more books of history that we're going to read. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is basically going to be retelling 1st through 4th kingdoms with a very particular perspective. It's going to be very focused on Judah and very focused on the line of David and pointing us toward a Messiah. And we're going to have a few more books of history that are going to sort of fill in the historical gaps between 586 BC and the New Testament. But most of the rest of the Old Testament that we read is going to be from the books of the prophets and the Psalms and the Proverbs, are all things that are going to take place during this history that we've just read. And are going to expand on it, show us more of God's perspective on it, teach us more about it. But we've now gotten through this is the big framework of the Old Testament. Does anybody have any?
So when do they back to instituting or celebrating Passover? How far ahead? I have a reason for asking that.
What do you mean? How?
What's his face? Was that Josiah?
Yeah, who reinstates Passover.
And
And
then
then
you
the
got
ones
land
after
bread.
that, and then the after that, they don't have it anymore because they're evil.
Right.
So how far down
Well, this exile is gonna last 70 years. Pretty much exactly. So at 516, and we're gonna be reading coming up here in the next few weeks. We're gonna go through 1st and 2nd Chronicles because it's basically the same stories relatively quickly. And when we get into Ezra, 1st and 2nd Ezra and Nehemiah and those, that's gonna talk about the people coming back. But they're gonna start coming back in 516. In 516. And when they start coming back, then through Ezra, he's going to start reinstituting the law as the people come back. They're going to try and get their act together and do better this time.
And then, do they continue with that until?
Mostly.
See, that's why.
There are ups and downs between that.
That's why I kind of don't understand. I mean, the Jewish people, they're so focused on the Passover and celebrating it. You know, like
Yeah.
today's Jews.
Yeah.
Why are they stuck there?
Well, see,
They're stuck there.
a lot of that comes from what happens in 70 AD. 70 AD, when the Herod's temple gets
Temple's
destroyed. The second temple, the last temple, gets destroyed in Jerusalem. Okay, the focus of their religion all through this, even if it's been the wrong God, even if they've been doing it at Bethel and Dan with golden calves, the whole focus of their religion has been around animal sacrifices. Either the tabernacle and the temple, that's the day-to-day, right? Sin offering, thank offering, making those offerings, right? Those sacrifices. That's the whole focus of this religion. Okay? AD 70, no more temple. No more animal sacrifices. Okay? Christian community says, well, yeah, God got rid of it because we don't need it anymore. Because Christ's sacrifice was the final sacrifice. And so now the center of our communal life as Christians is the Eucharist, which celebrates Christ's sacrifice. The Jews, right, they have to figure something out. And the Jewish group, there are dozens of Jewish sects at that point in history. The only other one that survives is basically the Pharisees, which becomes rabbinical Judaism that we know today. And so they focus on what they have left. What do they have left? Their scriptures, right, that we call the Old Testament. Their festivals, right? You know, their patterns of dressing and praying and living their life. So they focus on, even though those were all peripheral things at this point in history to the sacrificial system. Once you pull the center out, all you have left is
The edges.
You know, all you have left is the edges. And so they become all about the edges, essentially.
Yeah, I guess because even on those feast days that are all listed, the primary reason was to go offer sacrifice.
Right, Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur.
You go to Jerusalem and you sacrifice.
and Passover, they're not sacrificing the lamb anymore. They just eat some lamb.
Exactly.
You know, I mean,
That's right.
you know, they don't put it on their door. You know. So the center of the religion gets pulled out, and that's what survives. And so that was one of the primary. If you read in the first and second centuries, like you read Saint Justin Martyr, his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, who's arguing Jew. That's one of his main arguments: is you guys don't have a temple anymore. You can't practice your religion. He basically says, you know, that he argues that basically proves Christianity right. Because God can't be worshipped the way you're saying he commanded you to worship him. So you must be wrong, and we must be right, because we can worship God the way we believe. And that's why Julian the Apostate, but clearly not a saint, who was Constantine's, not his son, he was actually his nephew, who followed Constantine as the Roman emperor. One of the things he did as the apostate was he tried to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem to try to discredit Christianity. And there were a whole series of accidents where people were killed, and he eventually abandoned construction. But he was the last person to try.
Is that why they didn't rebuild the temple in the last half century?
No, that's because there's now a mosque there.
Except on
And the local
Go on the
Muslim
rock is
folk
sitting
would be
there.
very
Yeah.
upset if they tried to tear down the mosque. So,
I
okay.
think it's the Western Wall.
Yeah.
I know there's what they call the Wailing Wall.
Yeah.
It's the Western Wall.
And that's a piece of the retaining wall from Herod's temple.
Yeah, that is retaining.
It's important to note that at this time, Solomon's temple ceases to exist.
Right.
There's nothing of it left.
It's wiped out.
So that wailing wall is a piece of the,
So why would they rebuild Herod's temple?
770, because of the Dome of the Rock.
because of the,
The Dome of the Rock got there.
The mosque.
and we'll get into the building of the second temple and stuff when we get up into the Maccabees and start talking about Herod. Herod was a really interesting guy. He dated Cleopatra for a while. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah.
Was Daniel in the first wave that went out since he was
Daniel
prince, sort of?
Daniel was in this last wave
The last one?
because he was a kid.
Oh,
He and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego
okay.
we're all really young.
So they didn't take children?
They didn't take kids. They're taking people who do a trade, people who could do heavy lifting, people who are trained military. So he goes in the last group, and then he's gonna outlast the Babylonian Empire. He's gonna end up in the Persian Empire when the Persians come. But we'll talk about them. Well, thank you everybody for coming. And
Thank you.
this big chunk of the Old Testament.
Very smart.
So smart.
You need to talk to my sister more. Look at the look on her face.